I used to be the senior editor in Europe, but I'm the global sports editor for the Wall Street Journal. I work with Jared, who covers baseball for us, as described, and we're here to talk about baseball and talk Swing Kings. I glanced at the schedule and saw that the Phillies were supposed to be on the road at Houston tonight, so it's been a very entertaining night of bad jokes about sign stealing, excuse me, but instead you've got us. So we're here to talk about the national pastime, Swing Kings, Jared's great new book, and all things baseball. So I think the place to start, Jared and I, we work together and talk every day during the pandemic, and we talk about the same thing every day since you came home from spring training in early March, Jared, which is are we going to play baseball this year or not? Opening day is supposedly 16 days away, but what's going to happen?
Yeah, I wish I knew. It's a great question. I somehow, even though the teams are back in camp and we have a schedule, it still feels hard to believe that they're actually going to make it to opening day, even though it's only 2.5 weeks away. You know, they're trying to come back starting July 23rd with a 60-game season, which would be the shortest season in the history of Major League Baseball. But we've already seen some pretty disappointing and sort of concerning signs in these first few days about positive tests of coronavirus, players choosing not to play over fear of the virus. There's still a lot of kinks that need to be worked out if they're going to actually make this grand experiment work.
Well, we should talk about the path of how we got here, but it's worth pointing out. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. Jared's in Jersey City, but he just got back from Clearwater, Florida, which is the spring training summer camp home of the Phillies. How did it feel down in Florida when you left from a virus perspective, Jared?
Yeah, so I was staying at a house about 15 minutes away from where the Phillies train in Clearwater, where they had that outbreak that resulted in, I think, 12 ultimately positive cases among players and staff. And it was pretty wild what was going on in Florida. I had been in New Jersey for the entire pandemic ever since March 13th, the day after spring training originally shut down. And everyone up here in New Jersey and probably in Pennsylvania as well was pretty locked down for quite a while, and things have been opening up slowly. Not the case in Florida. When we got to Florida about 5-6 weeks ago, everything was open. Bars were open, restaurants were open. People were sort of operating as if nothing was going on. And of course, about 2 or 3 weeks after we got there, the cases started really surging. Now they're doing about 10,000 cases a day. And we're also seeing big spikes in Arizona, in Texas, in California. Well, those 4 states represent a third of Major League Baseball teams, 10 out of the 30. And baseball's plan, unlike every other sport, is not setting up some sort of bubble in one location. They're going to have teams traveling from city to city, staying in hotels, going on flights, playing in different ballparks. So the sort of the pathway for the virus to sneak into the clubhouse, it's a lot more open than maybe it is for the NBA, where everyone's going to be in one place, sort of stuck there, not leaving for 3 months.
You know, it might say something about the state of the game right now to talk a little bit about why it was so difficult for baseball. Restarting any of these sports during the pandemic has been a difficult, complicated process because of the health and safety protocols that are necessary to devise, which nobody's ever had to do before, but it was extra difficult in baseball. Why was that?
Yeah, baseball had a tougher challenge than any other sport. And the biggest reason for that has to do with when this all happened. When the NBA shut down, when the NHL shut down, they were 80% of the way through their season, maybe even more. I think the NBA has like 8 games left they had to finish. Baseball had played 0 games. They had to try to figure out a way to play a whole season. And by playing 0 games, it means they had made, as an industry, $0 and also paid out $0 to players, which was a big problem because it created this big fight that no other sport had of how much are players going to get paid to play in this bizarre, fanless season. And making matters worse is that Major League Baseball and its players have a terrible relationship right now. They've had labor problems going back the last 3-4 years stemming from issues with free agency and competitive integrity. The word tanking has come up a lot in baseball in the last few years, and it's created an environment where they were unable to agree on how much players should be paid. They couldn't even agree upon what they already agreed upon. They made a deal in March, and immediately after that deal was signed, they were already arguing over how to interpret the language in that agreement. In fact, ultimately, they never even came to a new deal. This ended when the commissioner, Rob Manfred, just said, all right, well, we can't figure this out, so here's the schedule, show up next week. And that's what's happened. It was really ugly and sort of portends really bad news for baseball moving forward as this labor feud. It's not going away anytime soon. So even if we get baseball now, I would recommend really savoring it, because I don't know for how much longer it's going to be on our TVs without a work stoppage or a fight.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty bleak outlook going forward if this recent negotiation to get the season started was any indication of what the future brings. So it's a 60-game season. The Phillies open with the Miami Marlins in a couple of weeks. What's interesting about a 60-game season, Jared? Could it, what unusual could happen? Is it worth playing? I mean, what do you're nobody's more of a baseball. Well, you love baseball, but you're maybe not the greatest traditionalist. But should we be embracing this or repelling it or fearing it? What?
Look, it's going to be weird. Baseball has not played a season of under 100 games in about 130 years or something like that, 125 years. So we've never seen anything like this, and hopefully we never have to see anything like it again. But there are some interesting things about this short season. It kind of goes against every sort of conventional wisdom about the sport, which is, well, it's such a long season. It's a marathon. The cream always rises to the top. At the end of the season, we really know who the best teams are because they survived 162 games and they're the ones going to the playoffs. Well, in 60 games, all bets are off, which I think for a team like the Phillies specifically is actually a good place to be. I mean, that NL East is very competitive. And going into the year, I don't think the Phillies are really seen necessarily as the best team in the division, or maybe not even the second best, but certainly very competitive. And now in 60 games, all it takes is one hot streak to end up winning the division. Remember last year? Go ahead.
The way it's set up, it's going to be a brutal stretch for the Philadelphia Phillies, though, and everybody in the East, right? Though, because the way that the schedule is set, you're playing basically only teams in your geographic area. So you're playing the National League East, of course, but then you have to go play the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Blue Jays. This is going to be. You get a couple of days where you get to play the Orioles, but there's no breaks in that schedule.
No, it's we're talking about they're playing 10 games each against teams in their division, so that's 30 games against the Braves, Mets, and Nationals, and then you add in another 10, 15 games against the Yankees, the Rays, and the Red Sox. So look, their schedule is really tough. It's the same schedule the whole NL East is facing, but remember last year, after 60 games, the Nationals were in fourth place in the NL East. They went on to win the World Series, which just shows you that a lot of weird stuff could happen in 60 games. I think, Bruce, you could talk about the Mariners a little bit. What would have happened if they had a 60-game schedule?
Well, yeah, this
is a few times.
One of the banes of Jared's job is that I'm a Seattle Mariners fan, and so periodically, and unlike most editors who would have his reporters try to write stories that burnish their favorite teams, I kind of do the opposite. We refer a lot to how pathetic the Mariners are. But it's true that if you Jared went back and looked at what would have happened in the 8 or 9 seasons since the second wild card was added, if you had only played 60 games, who would have made the playoffs? And it turns out a couple of teams who made the World Series, including the Nationals, would not have made the playoffs. And my Seattle Mariners, which have not famously made the playoffs since 2001, the longest drought in all of professional sports, would have made the playoffs twice in the last 5 years.
And every single in one of those years, at least one team and as many as 5 that made the playoffs would have missed, which you could pretty much assume that 2, 3, 4 teams that would have made the playoffs in a 162-game season won't in a 60-game season, which makes a 60-game season kind of exciting. It's a real sprint. Every game is really going to matter. one bad week could truly torpedo your whole season, which is not the case in a normal year. So what's fun about it is that every team, as we sit here today, mostly every team, has a real chance to go to the playoffs, to compete for a championship, which really isn't the case in today's baseball, where it seems like typically in a full season, you already could have cast aside 5, 6, 7, 8 teams. That's really not the case this year.
Yeah. So in a game where a lot of people, even people who love it, think some things need to be shaken up, there's going to be they're going to try some things this year that they wouldn't in a normal season. They're going to start extra innings with a runner on second base automatically and things like that to try to spice things up. Every game will matter, obviously. There's going to be some scheduling matchups that we wouldn't have had otherwise under this schedule, and most notably the Dodgers and the Astros going at it, the sign-stealing grudge match, rematch of their World Series from 3 years ago. So there's some exciting things to look forward to, right, Jared?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, this is a great opportunity to just see baseball in a way we've never seen it before. It's going to be weird. It's going to be different. But the alternative was them not playing at all, which for anyone who loves baseball like me, that was a horrible idea that they might go the whole summer without playing. They still might, but I'm hoping they figure out a way to work it out. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be something different. And look, I wrote an entire book about how in ways baseball is changing. So clearly I'm willing to accept change and new things in this sport.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. But what Jared just said is true. He really does love baseball, and he's not. I mean, I know this from experience. Like, covering something that you really care about is kind of difficult, because when you get into these jobs, you see the other side of it that sometimes isn't always visible in public, and it can be very difficult, can't it, Jerry? It's that you're seeing things that as a romantic baseball fan, you didn't always imagine were going to happen.
Yeah, we really experienced that in the last just couple of weeks and months, covering this labor dispute, when you're really getting in the weeds. And I'm spending every single day for month, 2 months, talking to people from MLB, talking to people from the players union, and it's so ugly, and the relationship is so bad, and it's so much worse than I think even probably gets sort of made public or even shows in the coverage. It's really that bad. And as someone who loves baseball and really does view it so romantically and loves the history and really wants to believe in baseball's sort of place in American society, yeah, it stinks to see sort of the stewards of the game, the people who are in charge of bringing it into the future, locked in this sort of endless argument that is so hard for most people to relate to because it's so much money. This is still, in spite of all the problems baseball has had, made about $11 billion in revenues last season. So it's obviously very difficult for, I think, the average fan to look at that and really wrap their heads around the fact that they could be still having these same arguments they seem like they've been having 25 years ago in 94, 95, and going back before that to all the other work stoppages. In some ways, nothing's really changed.
Right, but baseball has changed in some key ways that we'll discuss as we turn to talking about the book a little bit here. Swing Kings, buy it on your website. It's on stage left to Jared Diamond. It's a terrific book. It's really gets you thinking about the way that like sort of things in these tradition bound sports or any organization, have to change. In this case, the first time I can remember hearing about this project was when I had just come back from my previous posting in London, and Jared and I were first working together. And in that winter, the first winter that Jared was writing about the National Baseball beat for us, he came to me and he said he wanted to do a story about some guys in baseball who were using private hitting instructors who were not affiliated in any way with the clubs. They were, hired by, privately by these guys, like a private guitar teacher or something, to come in and teach them how to swing. And what they were doing was teaching them how to swing at a baseball in a way that would have, made the traditionalists, very angry, because it was completely different from what, had been taught for a long time in baseball. And that story which ran in 2017 in the Journal, the gurus behind baseball's search for the perfect swing, really started you off on this project, didn't it, Jared?
Yeah, that was the story that kind of started it all. But I became interested in this topic really going back to my very first year covering baseball at all, which was 2013 for the Journal. I was covering the Mets. And that winter, in between 12 and 13.
So it was a hardship assignment. Yeah.
Brutal. I was the Mets. I made a signing that offseason, a very insignificant signing a former Phillies outfielder, Marlon Byrd, who played for the Phillies for a long time, as sort of a speedy sort of outfielder, didn't hit for a lot of power kind of guy, stole a lot of bases. The Mets signed him to a minor league deal. He was 35 years old. He was coming off a drug suspension. And it was such an insignificant signing that I'm pretty sure I didn't write a single word about it when it happened. No one ever thought he was going to make the team. He did make the team. And not only did he make the team, by the first week of May, he was the Mets cleanup hitter and ended up being their best hitter that year by far. And it was completely shocking. And I spent all season trying to sort of understand what was going on and how he was this good. And he really wouldn't talk about it. He was totally coy, wouldn't get into it. He would kind of say, I made some changes to my swing, but I can't really talk about it. It wasn't until the very end of the season when the Mets had traded him to the Pirates. He was helping the Pirates get to the playoffs for the first time in like 20 years. And he finally sort of lets me and a couple others in on his big secret, which is he had spent the whole offseason working with this guy in California named Doug Latta, who was a swimming pool repairman who didn't play baseball above like junior college, and never coached baseball on any level besides like high school. And this guy, who happens to own a batting cage outside of LA, taught him more about hitting than any major league hitting coach or professional hitting coach he had after a dozen years in the majors. And that absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like desperation to the common baseball fan. I mean, of course, the prevailing orthodoxy of baseball is that you can't teach it if you haven't played it, right?
Exactly. That was always the case. You couldn't coach professional baseball or even get into the game if you didn't play it yourself. There was this incredible block in that regard, which isn't always the case in other sports. We've seen in the NBA and the NFL coaches who did not play in the NBA and the NFL. But in baseball, it's such a traditional game. If you didn't play, you don't get taken seriously. That wasn't the case with Marlon Byrd, who was sort of at the end of his career. He knew he was going to be out of the league if he didn't make a big change. And it's a really crazy story how it all happened that I won't spoil here because it's all in the book. It's really interesting. But it turned out that this crazy change that he made to his swing with this random guy worked better than anyone could have expected. And I sort of put it aside. I'd like, all right, well, yeah, it's kind of weird. Doesn't really I don't really buy it. But all right, if he says it, whatever. And then guess what? A year goes by, it's 2014, and suddenly JD Martinez has this huge breakout with the Tigers after being cut by the Astros. Justin Turner has his big breakout with the Dodgers and some other players around the league. And they all had similar stories, which is I went to go see Doug Latta or someone else, not Doug Latta, but a similar sort of guru who didn't play pro ball and changed my swing from scratch. And now I'm a superstar. And right when I started seeing, okay, there's now a pattern. There's 4 or 5 guys and not random players. We're talking about superstars, some of the best hitters in the league. So when I realized, all right, there's a story here that led to the article in the Journal. And even after that ran, it still felt like there was more to explore of this topic.
Yeah, no, these are really, I mean, these are not just like sort of, guys who were bad minor leaguers. These are really fringe characters in baseball who some of whom have had almost nothing to do with the game really over time.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, a guy like Doug Latta didn't play above junior college, was a swimming pool repairman, had nothing to do with baseball until sort of getting back into it and owning this batting cage. There's another person in the book, a very prominent character named Craig Wallenbrock, who worked with JD Martinez and others who truly didn't even play college ball. He quit the college baseball team at San Diego State before playing a single game, spent most of his 20s as a full-time surfer and a hippie, essentially, back in the early 70s. Didn't get back into baseball until the 80s, and he now is essentially considered one of the most influential sort of hitting minds in all of baseball, a guy that's been working in secret with great major league hitters for the last 25 years, guys like Paul Konerko and Ryan Braun and Chase Utley, of Philly legend. Chase Utley, while in college, while I was really struggling at UCLA, went to work with Craig Wallenbrock and continued to work with him, through part of his professional career whenever a swing needed a tune-up. And this was a guy that until turned his mid-70s, in his mid-70s now, was essentially ignored by the baseball community.
And what do the Dodgers think when Justin Turner shows up and says, "You know what? I'm working with the swimming pool repair guy"?
The Dodgers, when they first saw Justin Turner, he had been cut by the Mets, signed by the Dodgers to a minor league contract in 2014. The first thing they told him was, "I don't know who taught you to swing the way you're swinging, but stop doing it because you're not a power hitter. You're a little middle infielder. Your job is hit the ball on the ground, hit the line drives, and run." And Justin Turner said, okay, but didn't actually do it and said, no, this works. He started swinging for the fences and started hitting a bunch of home runs. And look, the beauty of all of this is when it works, no one says a word anymore. So it was a real challenge for Justin Turner. He had a couple of weeks when the season started in 2014 to prove that what he was doing would work. If it didn't work, they were going to cut him. They would have told him you have to change or we're going to cut you. But when you're hitting home runs, and Justin Turner at 340 in 2014, when you hit 340, no one says a word.
That's true. So let's talk about what are the Wallenbrocks and Doug Lattas telling players that's different from what was traditionally taught by hitting instructors. And how does it differ or not from what Pete Rose did or what Ted Williams did?
Anyone who played Little League in the last 50 years, myself included, was almost certainly taught to swing down, swing level through the ball, or swing, go straight to the ball, bring your knob to the ball. A lot of different buzzwords that essentially were hit the top of the ball, hit it on the ground. You might have heard things about trying to get backspin on the ball to hit for power. But essentially the swing that was taught was down. And that was a swing that was taught all the way through the major leagues to everybody until about 6-7 years ago. What these guys were teaching, guys like Craig Wallenbrock, guys like Doug Lattas, was the exact opposite. It was, we want to swing up. That our goal is not to hit the ball on the ground, is to hit the ball in the air. Every single swing, the goal should be to hit the ball in the air. And the way to do that is to swing with a slight uppercut. Now, it doesn't sound that interesting, but it was actually radical because it went completely against decades and decades of conventional wisdom in baseball, what was taught by just about everybody, except for one great hitter who you mentioned, Bruce, who was Ted Williams. Ted Williams is not like just about any other hitter who ever played baseball. He swung up. His job, his goal was always hit the ball in the air. He wrote an entire book in 1970 called The Science of Hitting about how to hit the ball in the air. And for reasons that we could probably do another hour on, no one really listened for decades to the greatest hitter of all time's advice. Right.
Well, he came on pretty strong, so maybe he just overwhelmed people with his views. Now, how does this move to try to just like swing up and try to hit every ball out of the park? How does this intersect with the data revolution in baseball?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we've seen is, well, there's a few things. We now have very basic data, which just shows hitting production on balls in the ground versus balls in the air. And those numbers tell an incredible story. Going back in the last 5 years, balls hit in the air, any ball in the air, from an infield pop-up to a home run, all those put together in the last 5 years, the collective batting average on those balls was 406. 406. Balls on the ground, it's about 245, 244, around there. So those were numbers that just didn't exist 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Nobody even kept track of it, right?
No one kept track of like the play-by-play data and did splits on balls in the air versus balls on the ground. We now have that data. So that's one really big data point as to why you want to hit the ball in the air. But more recently, that's improved even further. We now have wearable devices, bat sensors, things that you can actually put on your bat, hooked up to a computer, that show precisely, frame by frame, what the best hitters in baseball are actually doing when they swing a bat. Because the reality is you can't see it. It happens way too fast. Even in slow motion, it's hard to really see frame by frame what a hitter is doing. And the other thing that we now know is that you can't actually trust what great hitters say they do, because what they say they do and what they actually do are not always the same. Anyone that's watched Sunday Night Baseball in the last few years have heard Alex Rodriguez be a broadcaster. And at some point on that broadcast, he's probably talked about trying to swing down, trying to work back the middle of the field, hit the ball on the top of it. But in reality, if you watch his swing, that's not what he's doing at all. He was trying to hit the ball in the air. He was hitting the bottom of the ball. He was swinging up. So these technologies have played a huge role in understanding truly what the great hitters do. In addition to that, we now have Statcast, which has tracked things that never could have been measured in the past. Things like the buzzword that everyone loves to hate, launch angle, which shows the exact sort of angle at which the ball comes off the bat. And it's very clear what the ideal launch angle is. And it's not a launch angle that results in the ball going on the ground. Bruce is on mute. Bruce is still on mute. I don't know what he's saying, but he's on mute. 1 second. All right. Well, hopefully that changes. So I'm just going to vamp until someone figures out how to get.
Okay, I'm working on it, Jared. It looks like Bruce, it's on your end. Somehow your microphone is muted.
All right. Well, anyway, Bruce, while you figure that out, I don't know what happened, but I'm just going to vamp. So it's fine. So anyway, this technology has played, like I was saying, played a huge role. And what it's done that's so fascinating is it's essentially taken the stuff that Ted Williams wrote about in 1970, 50 years ago. The science of hitting came out 50 years ago this year. And it really validated so much of what he wrote about, writing about swinging up, writing about hitting the ball in the air, which was totally ignored for such a long time by sort of conventional wisdom of the day. Now suddenly it's like, hey, this guy knew what he was talking about. This guy was right. Maybe we should have been listening to him. And one thing I'm asked all the time, and I've been thinking about a lot, is, well, why? Why didn't people listen to Ted Williams? After all, he is the greatest hitter of all time, potentially, certainly one of, sort of on the Mount Rushmore of baseball. Why did it take so long for people to listen to him? And there's a few reasons why. One of them is what Bruce sort of alluded to, which is his abrasiveness. He was not exactly sort of the best teacher. He was pretty rough, pretty gruff, didn't necessarily teach with a smooth hand. So I think that played a role. I talked to plenty of players who actually played for him while he was a manager of the Washington Senators in the 70s, who basically said Ted Williams' approach to teaching hitting was, just do what I do. It's not that hard. Well, it is pretty hard, and you need a little bit more than that. The other thing that I saw a lot was sort of what I came to describe as the he's a freak syndrome, where basically people said, well, yeah, that might work for you, but you're Ted Williams. You're the greatest hitter of all time. You have 20/10 vision. That might work for you, but that won't work for me. For the normal mere mortals among us, we have to swing differently. We have to swing the way that, say, a coach like Charlie Lau talks about. For any older baseball fan, definitely knows Charlie Lau, a hitting coach who became sort of the avant-garde of hitting back in the 70s and 80s, who taught a very traditional swing, hit the top of the ball, swing down. That was the conventional wisdom at the time. Charlie Lau, while a visionary in many ways, has been sort of superseded by the Ted Williams model because of people like Craig Wallenbrock and Doug Latta and all of this technology. So, of course, all of this raises, I think, a very important question that I spend a lot of time writing about at the Journal, which is, so what does this mean? Is this actually good? Is this something that's good for the game of baseball? And that's a really complicated question, because there's no doubt that the game is smarter than it's ever been before. It is more optimized. It is objectively better than it ever was. And it seems like Bruce might be back. Yeah?
Can you hear me, Jared?
Yep, you're back.
Okay,
cool.
Good. So pick that up. Is it objectively better? Is this a better baseball game than I mean, there's a lot of people that don't like this version of baseball. This like everything's a home run or a strikeout. The ball is rarely put in play. I mean, you've done some great stories that document how infrequently the ball actually gets put in play. Is this, it seems like the data revolution maybe has backfired on baseball in a way that in basketball it made the game more exciting. In baseball, it's led to more dead air.
This is the great sort of paradox that baseball faces in 2020, which is by any objective measure, the game is smarter. We understand more about the game than we ever have before. So from the perspective of, say, a general manager or a player, it is the best it has ever been. But that does not mean it's actually better for the fans, for the people watching, or people like you and me. Because ultimately, baseball, any sport, it's entertainment. It's an entertainment product. And there's a great argument to be made that while the game is smarter, it is not more fun. It might even be less fun. We see record number of strikeouts every single year, record number of home runs every year. What does that mean is that we now go many minutes, 5-6 minutes in between balls put in play. The game seems to be a lot of standing around, waiting for something to happen, the occasional burst in a home run, and not much else. And it's sort of come at the expense of things that sort of made baseball fun for most of its history. Feats of athleticism, speed, daring things on the bases, defensive great plays. Well, if the ball's not being put in play because everything's either over the fence or a strikeout, there are not a lot of good defensive plays anymore. So I think for a lot of fans, they sometimes feel like they're just watching a game of catch between the pitcher and the catcher.
Yeah, it feels that way. So we've got Phillies fans here. Is Bryce Harper a swing up guy?
Bryce Harper is the ultimate swing up guy. And I think that's pretty clear just by anyone who watches his swing. It's violent, it is loud, it is a lot of moving pieces, and it is definitely up. Bryce Harper grew up, as many Phillies fans probably know, in Las Vegas, which has sort of become unexpectedly sort of a hotbed of great hitting innovation. And a lot of that stems from one particular hitting coach in Las Vegas named Mike Bryant. Mike Bryant was a minor league baseball player for the Red Sox back in the 80s, not a very good one, did not really make it out of single A, but was a disciple of Ted Williams, became obsessed with the science of hitting, and vowed if he ever had a child, he was going to teach that child not to swing the way he was taught to swing, but to swing the way Ted Williams was swinging up. Well, he did have a child. That child turned out to be a pretty good baseball player, Chris Bryant, who went on to win an MVP in his second year in the major leagues, one of the best hitters in the game. And Mike Bryant has worked with a lot of really great hitters in the Las Vegas area. Joey Gallo is one, and Bryce Harper is one. And Bryce Harper's dad, of course, also played a big role in teaching him that swing. But Bryce is a great example of what we're talking about, because Bryce Harper strikes out a ton, hits a lot of home runs, does not hit for a high batting average, or at least didn't last year for the Phillies, but his overall production is still good. He still hits, he drives in enough runs, scores enough runs, he walks enough to make him an incredibly valuable player. But watching him, I think sometimes must have been very frustrating for Phillies fans, because he struck out so much, because he hit 255 or whatever he hit. And it just doesn't feel like the great hitters that we're used to seeing, who maybe didn't hit 40 homers, might have hit 25, but did it while hitting 310. There's an argument to be made that from an offensive standpoint, the returns of actually scoring runs, the Bryce Harper model is better. It scores more runs hitting 255 and hitting 40 homers. But it doesn't mean that's sort of more fun to watch on TV night in and night out.
What has happened? What do pitchers do to adjust to this, Jared?
So we've seen a few things. We've definitely seen a change in approach from pitchers. A lot of pitchers up in the zone try to combat guys swinging up by throwing things sort of up at the letters all the time. But the best way pitchers have to combat this, of course, is they just throw harder and harder and harder until it just is basically impossible to hit. Of course, velocity is at an all-time high. It goes up every single year. Not too long ago, the idea of hitting 100 miles an hour was incredible. It was this amazing feat if one pitcher hit 100. Now there's pitchers that are basically sitting at 100, and it seems like everybody who comes out of the bullpen every single night, this parade of relievers, are all throwing 98, 99, 97, 98. Really incredible stuff. People want to blame the hitters for this. And look, the hitters play a role. They are swinging for the fences. But I always feel the need to point out that the reason this is happening from where I sit, who is around this every day and talking to people in the game, it really starts with the pitching. The pitching is the best it's ever been. We talked about the velocity. We now see breaking balls that move in ways that seem to defy the laws of physics. We have this bullpen optimization so that every single pitcher you face is fresh, not tired, and is exactly designed to get you specifically out. And oh, by the way, we now have computers that tell exactly where you're probably going to hit the ball if you do hit it. So we're going to put all the fielders in that spot. So even if you do make contact, you're going to hit it right at somebody. So the really only way to combat this is not to try to get 3 or 4 hits in one inning to score a run, because you're not going to do it. It's impossible. The way you score runs is do it all in one swing. And I think that's sort of why you're seeing hitters go, well, singles are not going to cut it anymore. I better sell out a little bit and hit the ball over the fence, or we're never going to score any runs.
Does this seem less poetic to you, Jared, than the game you grew up with? I mean, didn't you kind of like it better when it was like this guy had a nose for where the ball was coming off the bat and all that kind of stuff? I mean, it seems the romance is a little bit gone, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a different game for sure. And I think we are eventually going to see it start to shift back a little bit, at least a little bit. It's never going to go all the way back. We're never going to go back to the 70s where everybody was swinging at the first pitch and everybody was just sort of looking to put the ball in play, and striking out was this incredibly taboo thing. The reality is, in most situations, striking out really isn't a bad thing for your offensive performance. In fact, you're much worse off swinging at a pitch an inch off the plate and hitting the ball on the ground to the shortstop than you are laying that go by and hoping you get one in the middle of the plate that you could drive. Singles don't cut it.
It really wasn't very long ago that striking out 150 times a year was a massive disgrace in the major leagues, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, even 100. When I was a kid, even just going back to the mid to late 90s, growing up as a baseball fan, my dad being horrified at guys striking out 100 times. Now we see guys striking out 200 times, and it's not even that shocking. And look, there's definitely a limit here. There is, at some point, you think the game has to come back. There are, I look at a guy I wrote about, a guy who's probably tormented the Phillies a bit last year, Jeff McNeil of the Mets, an infielder who does not hit for a lot of power, but hits for a high average. But he still ended up hitting about 20 home runs, but did it while hitting like 320. He was a really good hitter. And I think you're going to start seeing a little more value in guys like that, because the reality is you can do both. There are guys still that hit for a high average and hit for power. There are the J.D. Martinez's of the world, the Justin Turner's of the world. A lot of the guys I wrote about in my book, Josh Donaldson, are guys that still find a way to hit, in that 290 to 305 range and hit for power. But, we're still sort of feeling out as an industry how they're going to go about teaching this swing. There's still a lot of people that are probably teaching it wrong. There's still a lot of players that are trying to teach it to themselves. And if they just gone to work with Craig Wallenbrock, they wouldn't have this problem.
Right. Okay, so I think we're taking some questions, right?
For sure.
Are we going to take those, or is our host going to take them? I guess we are.
I am going to. I'm
okay,
coming
good.
back on now.
Our host is coming back.
I'm coming back.
Take the questions.
All right. I'm having a little trouble with my video, so I'll start. Okay, our first question from Bill. How will a 60-game season impact the focus for the sabermetrics associated with hitting home runs, long ball versus short ball?
Yeah, it's going to be really weird. As someone, today's baseball is so stat dependent, and it is stat dependent in part because of the length of the season. You hear all the time about sample size and how these things even out. And over 162 games, we sort of know how to measure something. And over 162 games, we're pretty confident that that is sort of a true measure of a player's performance. And teams use that data to inform their decisions and who plays and who they sign, how much money they sign players for, who actually is on the team and who's not. That's going to be really hard to do in 60 games, because 60 games is about 38% of the season. And actually, interestingly, there's a lot of players who are very concerned about how teams are going to be using the statistics this year, because, as I said, these statistics play a big role in how much players get paid if they go to salary arbitration or free agency. And players I talk to are already sort of foreseeing a world where if they have a very, very bad season over 60 games, the teams will go, well, you didn't do well over the 60-game year, so clearly you're not that good. We're not going to give you a big contract. And if they do have a good season, the teams are going to say, well, it was only 60 games. We didn't get to see how you would have done over the next 100, so we're still not going to pay you all that much. That is a real concern that players have, that these numbers over 60 games, which are going to be weird and flawed and not really necessarily indicative of that much, are going to be used against players sort of no matter what happens.
But this is a great question, actually. So in this shortened season, we mentioned that they're going to have, if a game goes to extra innings, both teams will start the first extra inning with a runner on second base with nobody out, as a way to sort of move things along, get things done, whatever. So if it's the bottom of the 10th and you start with a runner at second and nobody out, shouldn't you move the runner over and get a sac fly and go home? I mean, is this going to be some retro baseball that we're going to see, Jared?
Yeah, that's a huge question that a lot of people are wondering, including myself. Is this extra inning rule going to just result in a bunt to the very first batter? I don't know. I think it'll depend on the hitter who's actually up in the lineup. Look, the Phillies are not going to have Bryce Harper bunt if he comes up with a runner on second base. They're just not. I don't think Bryce Harper would even agree. He just wouldn't even do it if Joe Girardi gave him the sign. But a lesser hitter, if it's Didi Gregorius or Gene Segura, yeah, maybe we will. So actually, I think the extra inning rule, while very strange, and I'm not totally sure how I feel about it, I do think it's going to sort of be this sort of litmus test into throwback baseball, and whether it's still something that could work or should be worth pursuing in the future.
Right.
Okay, let's see. All right. Many fans, including me, desire to see less strikeouts and home runs and more triplets, stolen bases, etc. Is this a widely held view across baseball executives and players? And how can the game go back to its more traditionally exciting features for fans?
That's another great question. I mean, I'll preface that by saying, because I'm old enough to remember that, like when Bill James, the father of sabermetrics, first started publishing his famous baseball abstract in the back in the 1980s, he used to write a little synopsis of almost every player in the league. And there was a player on the Kansas City Royals named Willie Mays Aikens, who he always just repeatedly, year after year, write these funny rants against, because he had never hit a triple and was seemingly unable to make it to third base. That's not even part of the game anymore, is it, Jared?
Yeah, triples are declining for a variety of reasons. They've been declining for a long time. Ballpark size has a big role in triples. I mean, where are you going to hit a triple in Citizens Bank Park? There's really one spot sort of deep in left center. Maybe you could turn that into a triple if you get it all the way off that brick wall out there and it bounces away. But these parks are so small, it's kind of hard to hit triples in. But so the question of how do people in the game feel about it is actually really interesting and kind of complicated. I think if you really quizzed most GMs, people in the game, they would probably tell you that they actually preferred the game the old way. However, their job as a general manager of a baseball team, Matt Klentak's job, is not to make the game sort of aesthetically pleasing. It's to win as many games as possible. And these GMs, their job, what they do is look for any little tiny advantage to try to win as many games as they can. And they have deemed, using data, that this is the best way to win more games. But the great thing about these GMs is that they will operate under any framework, any constraints that are put upon them. So if the game were to change fundamentally, that would have to come from the top. It would have to come from Rob Manfred, putting rules in place to change the game. And guess what? Those GMs would still look for loopholes. They'd still look for ways to make the game better. Hopefully those loopholes don't involve banging on trash cans ever again, because I don't think I can handle any more trash can banging. They're still going to look for those edges, but they'll operate within the framework that's provided to them. So that puts the onus to me on Rob Manfred to say, all right, do I need to step in? And the reality is he's been very reluctant to do so, to actually make big fundamental changes to how the game is played. Other sports have been more willing to do that. You see the NBA, you see the NFL every year making rule changes solely designed to improve the entertainment of the game. The NFL decided that it's more fun to see receivers running free and catching long bombs, so they're going to make sure the rules allow for that. Same with the NBA. No one liked those little touch fouls. The NBA, they slowed the game down, so they just got rid of them. Baseball has not been willing to make those sort of changes to this point.
But why is that? What is it about either the current commissioner or just the the nature of administrating baseball that has been resistant to trying some of those things?
This is the blessing and the curse of baseball's storied history. Because baseball has been around for so long, and it sort of seemed more or less like the same game for all of that time, which is certainly not the case with football and basketball, where the games have completely changed. Like, they barely resemble the games they did 50, 60 years ago. Because baseball has sort of always been the same, going back to the early 1900s, there's this belief among longtime baseball fans that it's sort of unimpeachable. It can't be changed because that changes the history. It messes with sort of the generational components and qualities of baseball. But the reality is, to me, that's a really faulty way of looking at it, because in real life, baseball has changed dramatically, sometimes subtly, sometimes in really big ways, but it's always changing. Baseball is always changing. And the idea that the same game that Albert Pujols and Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio played is the same is just a faulty logic. It's not true. It was different. But the problem is, whenever anything changes in baseball, it sparks a month of very angry people, and baseball feels a real compulsion to listen to its most hardcore fans. The example I always give, if you remember a few years ago, when baseball set a rule, you could only visit the mound 5 times or 6 times, whatever it was. They set a rule, a limit on mound visits. That sparked about 3 weeks of breathless debate from hardcore baseball fans about whether this will ruin the game forever, that now they can't go to the mound whenever they want. Well, then the season started, and no team ever even came close to the limit. And after about a week, everyone forgot all about it. I think that would be the same with some sort of bigger changes. There'd be a month of debate, and then people would sort of adapt to it. But they've been afraid to do it to this point.
So when do we get the pitch clock?
I don't think the pitch clock could come any sooner. It should be here already. I'm a total proponent of the pitch clock, for what it's worth.
Right. All right.
Okay, we have another question here. The Phillies' last manager got into a lot of trouble here with his hitting coach, John Malley. What school of hitting was Kapler aligned with, and what are your feelings about bringing back Charlie Manuel just for hitting?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wrote about Charlie Manuel last year when they hired him, because he was sort of an old geezer back working in baseball in his late 70s, coming back to sort of rally the troops. Yeah, John Maley is someone who I would consider a relatively new age coach. He had a somewhat non-traditional background, was not a major league player himself, played in the minors. And Gabe Kapler, of course, is about as new age of a manager as you could possibly get. But I think the thing that is important to sort of remember is that the job of a hitting coach in Major League Baseball probably isn't the job that you think it is. I think people think that it's a very technical job, that's about changing mechanics every single day. Well, it's really not. Major League players don't really like changing their mechanics in the middle of the season. There really isn't time. They're playing every single day. And additionally, those coaches are responsible for not just one hitter, but for 30 hitters. So the job of the hitting coach is more about relationships with the players. It's about cheerleading. It's about sort of helping players get through the mental grind of the season. It's the off season where they could really go and make big changes to their swing. And why Charlie Manuel is so effective, guys like him, is that he does have this incredible way, even with his age, to communicate, to talk and deal with 30 major league hitters or 15 major league hitters, and helping them get through like the ups and downs of the long season. There is a place for that in baseball. There's also a place for there are these hitting gurus that are coaching swings one-on-one with hitters. And really, they probably shouldn't be the same person, or at least couldn't happen at the same time. It's just too difficult to navigate that.
Right. This is something we talk about all the time with Jared and I, is that I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of who runs baseball teams during the game. It's really the people that are on the bench managing the team. The game is actually sort of more or less run upstairs by the front office, isn't it, Jared?
Yeah, it's certainly the case today where we see front office people gaining more and more power, managers having a lot less. Look, the reality is baseball games kind of run themselves. They're not. It's not like football. It's not like basketball. The reality is anyone that watches a baseball game could probably manage along with the manager and do a pretty good job. Honestly, it's not that difficult to manage sort of the X's and O's of a baseball game, and it's sort of what the challenge is the relationship component. That's what a good manager does, and it's also what a good coach does. It's understanding the players, treating them all differently, knowing what makes them tick, knowing which ones need tough love, which ones need sort of a more gentle hand, and how to get players in out of slumps when they go into them. It's hard.
That's the point of view of somebody who just last year completed his first year as the manager of the Wall Street Journal softball team.
And we went to the championship with me having to do very little.
There you go.
Okay, and the hitter on the cover of Swing Kings, is that based off any player, or is it just kind of a general illustration?
Oh, it is a player. It's sort of hard to tell because they got rid of all the logos of him, but anyone that might know, that is JD Martinez of the Red Sox, with all of the Red Sox paraphernalia taken away. Well, JD Martinez is, if there's one player who's sort of like the main character of the book, it's probably JD. He is the book just fell down, has a fascinating story, and I thought he was a good cover artist, cover model, so he got the nod.
Okay, and I want to remind everyone that if you do not have your copy of Swing Kings yet, you can click the button on the screen that says buy the book here to purchase your copy from the Doylestown Bookshop. If you live locally, you can pick it up at the store, or we'll be happy to ship it out to you. If you have any more questions, this is the time to enter them. I have an ending question because I think we're at the end here. I like to ask, what are you both reading right now?
You want to go first, Bruce? What are you reading?
I'm reading I've never read any of his books before, actually, but I'm reading Eric Larson's book, which is a big hit right now, about the kind of very narrative, cinematic telling of the Blitz. I lived in London for a long time and was always fascinated by, meeting people in my neighborhood or on Primrose Hill who had lived through the Blitz. And so I'm going through that. It felt like great pandemic, reading, like sort of hunkering down and trying to get through something.
Right.
Well, I have been reading, finally, too late. I should have read it before, but just didn't get to it. Our colleague's book, Ben Cohen, The Hot Hand. Our great NBA writer and my friend wrote a great book called The Hot Hand. It came out about a week before mine. It's all about this sort of the idea of the hot hand, whether streaks are actually random or whether there's some sort of intangible quality that allows an athlete or anyone really to sort of get into the zone and have this great success over and over again. It's really fascinating, and my colleague wrote it, which makes it even better.
We did have one more question pop up, and this is for Jared. How did your appreciation for baseball change while writing this book?
Look, I've been very ensconced in the baseball world now for the last 8 years. So I feel like I was pretty in the world already while working on the book. I think that allowed me to write the book because I was able to sort of know who I needed to talk to. I knew a lot of people in the industry already. But what I didn't know very much about was sort of this grassroots side of it, just how much really is going on in terms of, these internet coaches and how many people there are out there that claim to have the secret sauce that could unlock this great potential in you, and they will gladly tell it to you as long as you pay them a lot of money up front. And I know about these people now because just about all of them reached out to me while I was working on the book. Once word got around that I was working on a book that involved all these independent hitting coaches, I got a lot of independent coaches reaching out to me and going, "Oh, you should talk to me. I know this. I do this. I know that. I quickly learned that most of them didn't really know what they were talking about. And one of the challenges of the book was trying to figure out who really knows what he's talking about and who doesn't, and who are the frauds and who aren't. It was sort of this vetting process I had to do. And I think what I sort of came away from was that people spend probably way too much money on private coaching, when really the best way to become a good baseball player is just to go play it. So many people I talked to in this book told me similar stories, which was they were naturally good athletes, good baseball players, who got worse after being coached wrong, coached in a way that perhaps they shouldn't have been. And maybe there's a place for coaching at a certain age, but all these coaches that I met who are working with 8-year-old, 9-year-olds, I don't know, maybe if I had an 8 or 9-year-old, I probably would not be spending a lot of money on coaching. I would just say, go out there and try to do the best you can and have fun.
It's not every swimming pool repairman that can turn your kid into Justin Turner, right?
Exactly.
And if we have time for one, and this is, I promise, the last one. This one's for Bruce.
Sure.
Bruce, what has it been like for you as an editor during the pandemic?
It's been one of the most engaging, busy, exciting times for all of us. I mean, I think I speak for Jared and all of our reporters at WSJ Sports. A lot of our friends came to us with these kind of hangdog looks. We're like, what are you going to do with no sports? And you're the sports department. Well, it's really been busier and more interesting from the start than almost any other time in the history of this industry. We were fortunate that I think we were looking ahead when the pandemic was like moving around from China, then to Italy, and started thinking early on about how this was going to affect our world. And we're writing about something that was looming large for us, which was whether the Olympics were going to be canceled in Tokyo this summer.
When are we going to Japan, by the way, Bruce? Like a week from now? A week from now we were supposed to go?
We were supposed to go next week, yeah. But we're not going ever now. But I don't think. But it's been like watching billions-dollar enterprises like these huge professional sports leagues with so many moving parts and so much money at stake and so many egos at stake, and watching them cast into this world where nobody knows anything has been really fascinating. And then, of course, when you layer that on top of that, all of the events after the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, which we've been writing about for some time in the sports world, at least at the Wall Street Journal, because Colin Kaepernick has been such a compelling, divisive, figure with his protest for years, that that has also just added this extra level of intensity to everything, even though there are no actual sporting events really happening to speak of, except for the Premier League and the UK is playing, and my team, the Arsenal, is still not doing very well. But besides that, it's been pretty dead. Okay,
well, that will do it for us. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And everybody, I encourage you to get your copy of Swing Kings. I hope you all stay safe. There you go. There's the book. All right. Thanks so much for joining us. Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.